In this tutorial, we are going to learn about variables. We're going to learn how we can make them in Unreal, as well as what are some of the basic types of variables that exist. So let's begin by talking about what is a variable. If I was just to bring up Paint here, so we can write this out. So variables have three distinct parts to them. They have a name. This is how we are going to refer to the variable, and it also helps us give an idea of what the variable could be used for potentially. We might have variables that are named health. We could have a variable named score, speed, so on and so forth. This, just naming it correctly, helps us give an idea of what this variable can indicate. So obviously something like health would be the health of the player, the score might be the score of the player, so on and so forth. The next thing variables all have are types. Types could include things like a number. When we saw in the print string tutorial about printing the event ticks delta seconds, that delta second was of a type number, specifically a float. We will take a look at those data types soon, but number could be one. We have things like string, which is the type of variable that our print string prints. There is Boolean, and all this is a true or a false value. And we can also have more complicated types of variable. There are a lot of types of variables in Unreal, but one of the most common complicated types we're going to use is another actor. So actors themselves, they're a variable. They have a name. When we create our blueprint, we give it a name, so that is the name of that variable. And other actors can use other actors as variables. We'll see this in collisions. Finally, variables have two main functionalities associated with them. We can either get a variable or we can set a variable. Getting a variable just means we are reading the value. So when we have a variable that's a number, for example, our health, when we say let's get the health variable, it just means we're going to read it. We can then see what the value is, whether it's 100, whether it's 50, so on and so forth. Setting a variable is just changing the value. So for example, our player might fall down a pit, which causes them 50 damage. So we might set the health. First, we have to read the health value, see what it is. Then we can subtract 50 from it, so we change it, and then we can see if the player's health is more than 0, they're not dead yet, and they can continue playing. Otherwise, we're going to deal with their death by maybe putting up an end screen, restarting the level, so on and so forth. The main two functions of a variable are get and set. Variables are very useful for keeping track of things. Without them, we really wouldn't have a game because we wouldn't be able to track different stats and change them. So now let's take a look in Unreal how we can make variables, as well as some of the different types of variables we have. So in Unreal, I'm just going to open up this BP test that I've been using for all these tutorials. And we can see that it's empty. On the left side, all the way down here, we have a little tab for our variables. We can see there's already one variable here that is smDrone, which also happens to be the static mesh that's associated with this blueprint. So just another way to think about it, all components are basically variables, and component is actually a type of variable in Unreal. So now let's use a print string node to explore some of these variables. I can just plug it into begin play. And then let's start making some variables and printing them. So to make a variable, all we do is hit this plus button. You can see it prompts us to give the variable a name. Again, that's one thing all variables have, is one of the things that variables has is a name. Whenever we make a variable, especially in programming, make sure you name it sensibly. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult for you later on as your code evolves to just go back and remember what you did. So make sure you name things sensibly. There are no use for these variables that I'm making right now, so I'm just going to call it test. Next to that, we have a drop-down box which shows us all the different variable types that Unreal has. Everything that is underneath these drop-downs are all more complicated types of variables, and everything that it shows immediately to us are all the basic variable types. And let's just run through these. We start with Boolean, which, as we said before, is just a true or a false. I can see this by clicking on it, and under default value, it first says, please compile this blueprint, so we will hit compile, and then we can see what test is. It's really just a checkbox. It's false or it's true. If I was to drag test and get it, remember getting is reading the variable, and let's just print it. Currently, test is false, so when I print this, it should print false. Real quick, I'm just going to change the duration of my printing so things are visible to a big number. We come back here, make sure that the blueprint's on screen, otherwise our actor is in the scene, otherwise our code isn't going to run. So we just drag them out there. Hit simulate, you can see it prints false. If I was to come back here, go here, change the default value to true, compile it, run it again, there, it's true. One of the main uses for Booleans is for branching, which is going to be another tutorial that comes out this week. And we will see the functionality of where Booleans are really useful there. I'm just going to delete this. Let's look at the other types that are there. A byte is something that we don't need to know. If you hover over it, it says it's an 8-bit number. We are more than likely never going to use bytes. Let's not worry about them. Next, we have an integer number. If I was just to set it to it and compile it, we can see, again, an integer is just a number. All integers are whole numbers, so they're non-decimal numbers. So it can be 2, that works. But if I type in 2.5, you can see it just makes it 2. So integers cannot be decimal numbers. And if you try and change it to 1, it is just going to round it down. That is a default operation of Unreal. Next, we have floats. Floats are also just numbers, similar to our delta seconds, which if you hover over, we see it's a float. Floats are decimal numbers and non-decimal numbers. And we can see that when we type in 4, it changes it to 4.0, just to indicate to us that it's a float. Here, if I was to type something like 4.5, it lets me do that, which for integers, it did not. If you know you're working with a number that doesn't need decimals, it's good to work in integers because integers are much quicker for the computer to calculate. Floating point numbers are a little slower, but because we have decimals, we get a nice granularity with the numbers and a high degree of precision. Next, I'm just going to combine these three together. We have name, string, and text. We have looked at strings. That is what our print string uses. It takes in a string. All a string is a collection of characters that make up usually a sentence. Name and text are two types of string that Unreal has. We are not going to worry about name too much, but text is something we're going to look at when we look at the UI. A text is basically a string, but it has a lot of options that you can change in it. Think about something like a word processing software like Microsoft Word or Google Docs. When you select some text in that, you can change a lot of things about it. You can change its font color or its color. You can give it a background color. You could make it bold, italics. You could change the font. You could change the font size. That is all the text is in Unreal. It would let us change those kind of things. So when we get into the UI builder, we can see that with text values, we can change its font, its size, its color, etc., etc. And finally, the last basic type is these three here, a vector, a rotator, and a transform. Let's just look at them one by one. Let's start with a vector. Let's compile it. And if you look here, all a vector is just three float values. We can see it's a 0, 0, 0.0, and 0.0 that shows us it's a float. And a vector is just three of those put together. If we drop this box down, we can see those three components of a vector is just x, y, and z. In Unreal, our location and our scale are basically just vectors. You can see even my location, it's just three floats, which is indicated by this 0.0 at the end of the number. So all our location and all our scale really is just a collection of 3 floats. We can see that by pulling out our test variable. Let's get it again. Let me just drag out the yellow node and let me type break vector. So this takes in a vector and it breaks it into its components, which are green, which are floats. As you can see, we hover over them. And so really, vectors, very simple. All they really are is a collection of 3 floats. Next is a rotator. A rotator is basically the same thing. It's a collection of 3 floats. You can see again, it says X, Y, and Z. There's a little star above that to indicate that the specific value of a rotator is in degrees. So our rotation in our transform is a rotator. Again, if I was to pull this rotator out and type in break rotator, you can see all it really is a collection of 3 different floats. The reason Unreal and really all game engines separate out rotations from the other types of vectors is because the math required for rotators is a fair bit different than basic scale and location vectors. So it's good for them to have separate types. So 1, we don't mix them up, and 2, they can give us functions that let us use this very nicely. But for our purposes, all we need to know is rotator, vector. They are just 3 floats put together. Finally, we have the transform. So let me delete that. Open this up. Let's change it to type transform. Compile it. And if we click transform, we can see similar to what we see in our viewport. We have a transform, and that has a location, rotation, scale. So if I was to pull this transform out and get it and break transform, you can see all my transform really is a location, a rotation, and a scale. And by looking at these colors, we can see that it is a vector, a rotator, and another vector. And all these vectors and rotators is just 3 floats. So really, a transform is just a collection of floats that are organized into 2 vectors and a rotator. So now knowing that, if we get our SM drone, we can use Unreal's function called get actor, or just get transform. And we have get world transform. And in our event tick, I'm just going to print this. Again, Unreal, very nice. They convert these variables automatically. We can almost literally print anything in Unreal. Very good to know. So if I compile this and I was to play, you see that it's very quickly printing out our translation, our rotation, our scale. When I start moving it on the y-axis, you can see that y number is changing. If I was to rotate it, you can see the rotation is changing. And the same goes for the scale. So this has been a real quick look at the variables in Unreal, what they are, how we can make them, what are the basic types of variables as well. Thank you for watching.